Welcome back to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we take dense sources, lexicons, commentaries, and theological articles, and we try to extract the precise knowledge you need quickly and thoroughly. Today, we are targeting a single potent Greek word. It's a word that sits right at the core of theology, defining the absolute nature of God. Yet the specific term is surprisingly rare in the New Testament. We're diving into ADFC or ἁγιωσύνē. Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We are going to break down the detailed source material, the lexical entries, and the biblical references to understand the surprising precision this term brings to the concept of holiness. We need to isolate its two critical applications. First, how it functions as an inherent attribute of Christ's deity, and second, how it applies to believers as a moral quality requiring active pursuit. You should finish this deep dive with a much clearer understanding of what the New Testament writers meant when they reached for this specific noun.
Yes, and this is a particularly rewarding study, especially when you think about the traditional theological stress on the absolute separation and moral perfection of God. When we talk about holiness in a general sense, it can become a bit of a vague concept, meaning set apart or just good behavior.
Right, it can be a catch-all.
It can. But what the sources show is that ἁγιώσυνē is a specialized, almost technical term. It helps us pinpoint not just a state of being set apart, but the inherent quality of sanctity itself, the essential nature of the divine. By focusing our analysis entirely on this one word, we uncover specific distinctions that other, more common Greek synonyms, they just don't carry.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with the mechanical structure of the word. Even before we look at the meaning, the way it's built, that tells us something critical about the type of concept we're dealing with.
It does. The lexicons are quick to point out its structure. It is formed from the common adjective ἁγιos, meaning holy. The suffix applied, stori, along with the lengthening of the vowel stem, is used explicitly to create an abstract noun of quality. This grammatical structure is a huge clue.
An abstract noun of quality.
Correct. For instance, the sources draw a direct comparison to dikaiosty, or righteousness, which is formed from dikos, or righteous. We understand dikaiosty not just as a righteous action, but as the essential quality of righteousness.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, in the same way, ἁγιωσύνē is the essential inherent quality of holiness. This is a characteristic, an attribute, distinct from a temporary action or a passing state.
And here is where the history of the word makes its selection by the New Testament writers so fascinating. The sources are absolutely clear about its rarity. This is not a common word in the everyday language of the time.
That's right. The sources note that this term is not found in pre-biblical Greek texts. It is either a highly specific theological coinage or a very rare usage resurrected for this particular purpose. This absence in the classical secular context strongly suggests that its function is exclusively theological, defined by a contrast that human language struggles to capture.
So if the New Testament writers needed a word for holiness, they had plenty available. Why reach for this new, rare construction? Why go out of their way?
Because of the need for precision. While the core meaning is holiness, sanctity, or divine quality, the defining feature assigned to it by the sources clarifies its role immediately. It expresses the quality of holiness as an expression of the divine in contrast with the human.
In contrast with the human, that's the key phrase.
That's the key. If you take that definition seriously, you realize it is functioning as a kind of theological fence. It separates the nature of the uncreated God from the nature of all created things. It signifies the absolute distinctiveness of God.
That makes a lot of sense. If you were a writer trying to explain something utterly unique, the very essence of divinity, you wouldn't rely on a common word that might carry unwanted human connotations. You reach for something rare or new.
You do, and this leads us directly to the necessary task of distinguishing it from other, much more frequent Greek terms for holiness that share the same semantic field. The options available in the Greek language demand we look closely at the nuance provided by the sources.
Let's dedicate some time to this. We have jourdnusht, which we are defining as the inherent, separate divine quality. How do the sources help us draw a sharp, memorable line between this term and the other related concepts?
We can start with ἁγιos, or hagios. This term also translates generally as holiness or divine quality. The single New Testament reference we have for this, which is provided in the source material, is Hebrews 12:10. There it says, believers are disciplined so that we may share his holiness. Right. And the key differentiating word here is share. Ἀγιos is used in a relational context. It describes the quality of God that can be transmitted or participated in by believers. It speaks to the effect of God's holiness upon us. It's the result of divine action, a kind of derived holiness.
Ah, yeah.
So while it relates to the divine essence, its application is focused on the believer's participation in that quality. It describes a characteristic that has been successfully communicated.
So if I'm hearing you right, aikistes is the source, the inherent unshared quality of deity, while eiktis is the downstream shareable result.
That is a very helpful way to put it. Now let's look at the third term mentioned in our sources, ositas or hosiotes.
Hosiotes.
Also means holiness, but it often carries a stronger connotation of piety, devoutness, or reverent observance towards God. We see this in passages like Luke 1.75, where the prophecy is that the people should live to be holy and righteous before him all the days of our life. Notice the pairing, holy and righteous.
The pairing with righteousness, dikiosti, is a clue, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Osites tends to be used when describing proper reverent conduct, especially in a covenantal or ethical relationship with God. It represents the human response of piety and dutiful reverence required by the divine standards.
Okay, so it's more about our side of the equation.
It is. If ikisi is the absolute defining quality of God, then osites often describes the human attitude and conduct that is appropriate in the presence of that quality. It is less about intrinsic divine nature and more about devout, proper behavior.
I see the distinction clearly now. If we think of God's nature, his separate, uncreated essence is ἁγιωσύνη. The portion of that nature he allows us to participate in is osites. And the proper human conduct that results from encountering that nature is osites.
That synthesis captures the essential differences defined in the source material, and it reinforces the central insight you should carry forward. When Paul uses ἁγιώστη, particularly in a highly charged Christological statement, he is bypassing the more common synonyms to intentionally communicate the absolute separation and inherent character of divinity. He's talking about the divine essence itself. That specificity matters a great deal when we encounter the word in its most critical New Testament context.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. That abstract, uncreated quality we just defined comes crashing into historical reality in the most significant usage of the word. Paul's introduction to his argument in Romans, specifically Romans 1.4, Paul uses this rare, specific word to define who Jesus Christ truly is.
Yes, this passage functions as a thesis statement for the entire letter, dealing with Christ's status and nature. Paul introduces Christ as having been declared Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead.
Toso ostesiros oi utin mi kata poima egosis ekisosynkra.
That's it.
And the crucial structure here, the thing that gives the verse its explanatory depth, is the antithesis, the clear contrast Paul sets up. He pits katasurka, according to the flesh, Romans 1.3, against kata peme gutusis, according to the Spirit of holiness, Romans 1.4.
This is the analytical centerpiece for the sources. This is what all the commentaries focus on. It defines two distinct realms of Christ's existence. The katusi relates to the natural human order. In this dimension, Jesus Christ is a human descendant of David.
Right, his human lineage.
Yes, this establishes his historical legitimacy and his claim to the earthly kingship promised to David's line. It anchors him in verifiable history.
But then comes the other side.
Then comes the counterbalance, kata myostis, and this refers to the divine supernatural principle. The commentaries clarify that this spiritual principle, which indwells him and defines him, is the very basis upon which he is declared othetos, Son of God, through the resurrection. The resurrection is the event that publicly verifies that divine quality.
Wait, if the source material identifies эгδοστή with deity itself, as we established just a minute ago, why does Paul use the word spirit here? Why not just say according to the divine nature?
That is a sharp and necessary question. And the sources deal with this by making a direct connection to the Old Testament. The phrase pneuma эгδοστής is identified as an exact rendering of the Hebrew or ruach hakodesh, the Holy Spirit.
So it's a direct quote, in a sense.
It's a direct conceptual link. Paul is using a highly specialized technical designation that links Christ's being directly to the Old Testament concept of the divine spirit.
And that spirit is more than just a general holy feeling.
Oh, much more. In the context Paul is using, it signifies the creative principle of life. Think about the earliest biblical context. The Spirit of God hovering over the waters in Genesis 1.2, that is the active creative agent that brings cosmos out of chaos. It is the principle of life that stands outside of and superior to the limitations of the natural order.
So by declaring Christ Son of God according to the Spirit of Isti, Paul is stating that Christ's defining quality is not just moral perfection, but the inherent, active, life-giving quality of God that can overcome death and corruption.
That's it. The resurrection is not just a miracle, though it is that. The resurrection is the visible, undeniable demonstration of this internal divine creative quality at work. It is the proof that Christ possesses deity, the quality that defines the new order. The sources are clear. Istuti here is functionally identified with deity itself because it is the quality that defines him as uncreated life itself.
Let's plumb this thread of the Ruach HaKodesh and the creator principle even deeper, because this insight seems crucial for the listener's appreciation of Pauline theology. How does this creative principle establish the people of God outside of the natural order?
Well, the sources connect this concept directly to the kaitasis, the new creation. In the Old Testament prophetic tradition, the Spirit was promised as the agent who would establish a new covenant and a new order. You see this in Ezekiel 36, Jeremiah 31. This new order involves receiving a new heart and a new spirit, transforming the people from the inside out.
Okay.
The key is that the natural order, defined by the sork or flesh, is subject to sin, weakness, and, well, death. This is the realm of the old creation. The Spirit of deity is the agent that transitions reality itself into the new creation.
And Christ, through his resurrection, is the first and foremost demonstration of that transition.
He is the Lord of the new creation. The resurrection is the moment where this principle of creative divine holiness utterly defeats the limitations of the old order, the death, the decay, the weakness inherent in the structure. Because he possessed this unique quality of agisti, he had to be declared Son of God in might. His ability to overcome death validates his status. It is the quality that makes him uniquely divine and victorious. This realization elevates our understanding of Romans 1.4 quite a bit beyond a simple statement of Christ being generally holy.
It reframes the doctrine entirely. We're not just talking about a moral attribute. We're talking about ontological, creative distinction. This sets the stage dramatically for the next section because it seems impossible that Paul would apply this monumental term to us, but he does. How do the sources explain this pivot in application?
That unexpected application is where the tension and the ethical mandate arise. The sources describe ἁγιωσύνη as transitioning from an inherent, unachievable divine quality to an attainable but necessary ethical quality for the believer. This shift demands careful analysis in 2 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians.
We transition now from the absolute, uncreated ἁγιωσύνη of Christ, which conquered death, to our calling. Paul applies this rare term to believers in two critical locations, establishing a high bar for our conduct. Let's start with 2 Corinthians 7.1.
Paul writes there, "Ipatotse Augustine and Kosi, perfecting holiness in the fear of God." The context here is an appeal to complete cleansing and purification after urging the Corinthians to separate themselves from pagan associations.
Okay, so there's a practical reason for this command.
There is, and the crucial word here, which defines the human task, is the verb ipio, meaning to complete or to perfect. When this term, ikoisti, is applied to a human, it is not a static state granted instantly. It is something that requires continuous active completion. This is the ongoing moral dedication required of us.
But if we are already set apart by the Spirit, by the poiamagostes, why does Paul mandate continuous completion? Doesn't that contradict the completeness we have in Christ?
That is the essential theological tension that our sources address, and they are careful to root this necessary moral dedication in a prior reality, the atonement. The sources explain that the basis of our human ἀγιωσύνη lies in the finished work of Christ, which establishes us as the ἰδωποιστή, the holy nation, the people set apart. We are fundamentally holy in status.
Positionally holy.
Positionally holy, yes. However, this divinely created status then demands practical, ethical completion in our daily, temporal, moral lives. The foundation is settled, but the superstructure must be diligently built. Sanctification, in this sense, is the active manifestation of our positional holiness.
And that building, that ethical completion, is only possible in the fear of God.
Yes. The sources clarify that the fear of God is not terror, but reverence and awe. It is described as the normal attitude in the environs of the holy.
The normal attitude.
It is. If you truly grasp the absolute majestic quality of God see that we discussed in Romans 1.4, the appropriate response is a deep self-conscious awe. This atmosphere of fear and respect is what provides the necessary framework and motivation for the diligent moral completion Paul requires. It keeps us from taking our set-apart status lightly.
So Paul is saying, look at the vast, unapproachable holiness of God. Live in the appropriate fear of that quality, and that will motivate your necessary completion.
That's a good way to put it. Now, we must look at the specific outcome of this completed ἁγιωσύνη. What does it look like in practical terms? The sources identify the resulting quality as chiasis, or purification. This is further specified as pneumatophysical purity psychis, patuanto purity of both the flesh and the spirit. This purity is explicitly set against akasavis, or uncleanness.
Pneumatophysical purity is a highly technical phrase. Let's make sure we unpack that conversationally for the listener. In plain terms, what are the sources saying here about the scope of this required purity?
The sources are stating that this purification is total. It is not enough to have pure thoughts or intentions, which would be purity of spirit. This ἁγιωσύνη must actively govern and cleanse how we use our physical bodies, purity of flesh.
So it's both internal and external.
Both. And the source material specifically relates ἕγιωσυνē here to sexual matters, suggesting the human ἁγιωσύνη must manifest visibly by resisting impurity in bodily conduct.
I see.
This point tells you that the human quality of ἁγιωσύνη has a practical, cleansing, ethical function that demands control over the natural realm in the believer's life. If Christ's divine ἁγιωσύνη conquered the sorrow of death, our human ἁγιωσύνη must conquer the sorrow of corruption and impurity. This really stresses the ethical character above all else.
We see a parallel application in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, reinforcing this ethical demand, though with maybe a slight shift in focus. 1 Thessalonians 3.130 keys aims to strengthen your hearts blameless in holiness.
That's its tiran tes kariaias imigosti.
Right.
The aim here is the strengthening stay-light of the heart, karesis. This shifts the focus internal, focusing on the center of character and thought. Yet the required outcome is still external visibility, being ementus, blameless.
So it starts in the heart.
It starts in the heart. Just as in 2 Corinthians, this holiness is completed in ethical dedication. But here, the point of origin is the inner source of that blamelessness, the purified heart. The two applications work together. The inner quality is purified. 1 Thess 3.13, resulting in external conduct that is constantly completed, 7.13.
And the sources reference the origin of this human ἁγιωσύνη again, connecting it back to the idea of being set apart.
Yes, the origin is always the atonement, which is why the sources identify its character as cultic. Cultic in the sense that the believer is dedicated or consecrated for service and relationship with God. Our status is consecrated by Christ, but that consecrated state requires ethical maintenance. It demands a distinctive life in God's presence, characterized by high moral standards.
Let's synthesize this human application clearly. When Paul uses ἁγιωσύνη for believers, he is creating a direct line between God's absolute nature and our expected lifestyle.
He is. The tension is necessary. Believers are called to reflect a quality that inherently belongs only to God. This requires two things simultaneously. First, a positional reality rooted in the atonement and the creative priomia of tusis,
Which we receive by faith.
Yes. And second, a lived reality that requires diligent moral effort and dedication, leading to total purity of heart and body. The ethical output is the visible evidence of the divine quality at work in the life of the new creation.
To truly grasp the weight Paul gave this word, we should probably broaden our view and see how the word functioned just before the New Testament era, specifically in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, or the LXX. This shows the theological color Paul inherited.
Right. The sources provide 5 specific references where ἐγώση appears in the LXX. Psalm 29.5, Psalm 95.6, Psalm 96.4, Psalm 144.5, and 2 Maccabees 3.1. By examining what Hebrew words these references translate, we see the semantic breadth established.
What is the main expected alignment? What Hebrew word is it usually translating?
Unsurprisingly, the main alignment is with Sua Kodesh. This is the standard Hebrew term for holiness, sanctuary, or something set apart. Our sources confirm this connection in several places, reinforcing the core concept of dedication and separation for God's purposes. This aligns perfectly with the idea of ἁγιωσύνη as a quality of being set apart.
But the sources also introduce a crucial nuance in several verses, a pairing with concepts of strength and majesty that seem to go beyond simple moral purity.
This is the fascinating detail that links the Old Testament view of holiness directly back to Paul's use of in power, or idunami in Romans 1.4. The sources note that the element of glory or majesty is frequently paired with эгώστη, even though they are not synonyms. This pairing signifies the context and display of that holiness.
How does a majestic holiness differ from a purely moral one? Give us some textual examples to bring this to life.
Okay, consider the pairing in Psalm 95.6. The LXX uses ἁγιωσύνη to align with mus os, which means might or strength. When you proclaim holiness alongside strength, you are describing a characteristic that is active and dynamic. It's not passive separation, it is a forceful presence. God's holiness is inherently mighty.
It has force.
It has force. Then look at Psalm 144.5. Here, ἁγιωσύνη aligns with quehad, which signifies splendor or majesty. When the LXX translators chose эгis to communicate the splendor of God, they were defining a quality that is observable, awesome, and commanding. A majestic holiness controls its environment. It commands awe, that foe we talked about, and it demands recognition.
So when the LXX writers opted for эгisi, they were communicating a holiness that is forceful, not just quiet. It is not just about being ethically good. It is about radiating divine might and separation.
That's right. This makes Paul's statement in Romans 1.4 about Christ being declared Son of God in power, according to the spirit of эгis, completely consistent with the Old Testament understanding of this concept. The idea of this being a strong, governing, divine quality is the thread connecting the Testaments. It's a holiness that governs reality.
Finally, we should probably look at the full semantic field that our sources connect to this word. This shows its range of application across theological practice.
It does. The lexical entries group ἁγίωσή with a broad range of related concepts, confirming its central position. It acts as the nexus where different theological concepts intersect.
What kind of concepts are we talking about?
Well, we see connections listed to reform, awe, purification, hallow, clean, dedicate, sanctify, ceremonial holiness, and even regulations concerning cleanness and uncleanness. This grouping confirms that ἁγίωσή is not one-dimensional. It successfully bridges the gap between ceremonial setting apart, being acceptable for the sanctuary, and intense moral purity, which we saw mandated in 2 Corinthians 7.1.
That helps clarify why Paul could use the same word for both Christ's ontological essence and the believer's required ethical conduct. It is a singular concept demanding absolute devotion, a devotion expressed by moral purity and a state of being set apart. The scope covers being personally dedicated to God, whether that dedication is expressed by purity of heart or separation from the world.
And this convergence is the key insight for understanding Paul's mandate to believers. When he instructs us to pursue ἰδώστη, he is drawing on the full scope. The Levitical concept of dedicated separation, the prophetic demand for moral purity, and the majestic, governing quality of the divine essence seen in the Psalms. It is the comprehensive word for what it means to belong entirely to the one true God.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together.
Let's summarize the core findings for you by revisiting the two critical applications of ἰξής. This knowledge allows for a very precise understanding of holiness.
Okay, application number 1.
First, we establish that ἁγιώστη is the absolute deity quality demonstrated in Christ's resurrection. That's Romans 1.4. Here, it is identified with the paina ἁγιώστης, which the sources define as the creative principle of life that stands entirely separate and opposed to the natural limits of the flesh. This is God's inherent, uncreated nature, the conquering quality.
The quality of being God, essentially.
In a word, yes. Second, we saw that ἁγιώστη is the required ethical quality that believers are called to complete in the fear of God. That's 2 Corinthians 7.1 and 1 Thessalonians 3.13. This application requires active, ongoing moral dedication, resulting in total charis's purification of both flesh and spirit. It is the human reflection of the divine standard that must be attained.
This analysis provides a great deal of clarity. The source of our sanctity, our setting apart, is entirely external, rooted in the atonement and activated by the spirit of holiness. But the display of that sanctity requires intense internal and external dedication. We are called to continuously complete a quality that only God possesses inherently, making our sanctification a process of manifesting his nature.
And this brings us back to the final necessary connection, something for you to mull over. We established that ἁγιώστη is fundamentally tied to the creative principle of life, which makes us part of the new creation, the kainekios.
Right.
So consider how the necessary ethical completion, the epitale of 2 Corinthians 7.1, reflects the ongoing reality of that new creation manifesting itself against the natural fallen order. If Christ's resurrection was the ultimate manifestation of ἁγιωσύνη, conquering the natural order of death, then our daily pursuit of moral purity is the incremental ethical outworking of that same new creation principle at work in our lives. It is a constant confrontation with the corruption of the old order, offering a specific and helpful lens through which to view your continuing sanctification as a genuine participation in Christ's creative resurrection holiness.
A very helpful truth to conclude on. Thank you for diving deep into the sources with us today to understand the distinct and crucial meaning of ጵ.
Until next time.